Okay, I'm going to get us started here this morning with the 2019 PAG 02 overview. Some of the items that we're going to touch on here this morning is just discussing some of the minor changes with the new general permit, the PAG 02 eligibility, the administrative process. Some steps have changed, some time frames, and the individual permit issuance is slightly different now. The NOI is now a separate form from the individual permit application. The co-permittee and transfer forms have changed, and the process for each of those is now different. Then we'll get into some detail on the general NOI, as well as the individual application. We'll touch on modules 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we'll just have a brief intro to the spreadsheet before we take a break and get into the additional topics. So back at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, you guys probably all remember about your clients getting the existing permittee acknowledgement letter and form that was to be sent into DEP. This was just verifying that you would remain in compliance with the new general permit. And the second part of that was if you proposed a major amendment, then you would have to change your BMPs to non-discharge or ABAC BMPs. And that information was provided on the DEP FAQ document that came out in April. Another big change with the new PAG 02 is that all of the general permits will expire at the same time, 12/7/24, and the individual permit still gets its 5 years minus a day. A proof of instrument recording is now required at a permit transfer, in addition to the notice of termination. The water quality analysis is required to be done using the PCSM spreadsheet, but the spreadsheet is still voluntary or optional for demonstrating volume control and rate control. We'll talk about some of the PAG 02 eligibility here. This is sort of similar to previous PAG 02s, and I'm not going to go through all of these in depth, but some of them I am going to touch on. So this one here, discharges to surface waters that are impaired according to the integrated report would have to use ABAC or non-discharge alternatives. And that eligibility criteria only applies to stormwater discharges directly to impaired waters. The next one would be discharges to EPA approved or established TMDLs. And this does include the Chesapeake Bay. So in those instances, you would also need to use non-discharge alternative or ABAC BMPs, as well as meeting a waste load allocation if one was established. And just in Cumberland County, there are no waste load allocations, but this would make it that all PAG 02s in Cumberland County do need to use ABAC or non-discharge alternatives. Discharges to MS4s or combined sewer overflows, you cannot discharge to those without the consent of that permit holder unless the discharge results in a no net increase in volume rate or water quality. And there is a new form that can be used to provide that information and also get the permit holder to sign off on. And then this one has always been there, I believe, but this is dealing specifically with PPC plans about storing or utilizing pollutants or chemicals, oils, solvents, that kind of stuff on site. Then PPC plans would be part of the permit. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about the administrative process. And this hasn't changed substantially, but there are a couple minor changes. One of the first things is going to be looking at the eligibility. That's why we sort of talked about that a little bit. And at the beginning of the NOI, there are those eligibility items where you sort of check off on that you're meeting. But one of the big things, and we have not been doing this, but it looks like we're going to have to sort of stick to this pretty strictly moving forward, is dealing with the fees. So there's a document, or I guess a directive that came out of the Office of Administration and Management dealing with fees, that until the fees are correct for an application, we are not to be getting into the completeness review. So all fees need to be verified as correct before we can start the completeness review. If it is incomplete, and we send out a notification or contact the applicant or consultant, then there is a 60-day period where you can make corrections, and if you need more time, you can get up to one 30-day extension. If after you reply, there are still deficiencies, then we can notify you that the NOI has been denied. And if you do not respond within the 60 days, then the application would be withdrawn. We would consider it withdrawn. And just one other thing this is one of the notes from the instructions, is that only one completeness or incompleteness review letter will be provided, so that we don't get caught into a loop of going back and forth for a long time on trying to get everything complete. So after it would be complete, we would get into the technical review. If there are no technical deficiencies, then we would move to final action of approving the general permit. If there are technical deficiencies, but they are not significant, then we will reach out informally to either the applicant and or consultant to try and resolve those minor deficiencies in a relatively short time frame. If there's significant technical deficiencies, we typically would provide a written notification, and typically we would only provide one deficiency notice before we would move into elevated review or something like that. But once the technical deficiency letter is sent out, you would have 30 calendar days to respond. And similarly, you may request an extension to provide up to 30 additional calendar days. And the request for that extension has to be related to the deficiencies and not because of other agency reviews, like potentially an HOP permit, municipal stormwater reviews, that kind of thing. It has to be specifically related to the deficiencies that we notified you about. If there are still deficiencies after the response is received by the district, then the NOI would go to the elevated review process, and coordination would be done there with DEP and the district to try and come to a resolution. One thing to just keep in mind is that the same information is provided in multiple areas throughout the application, whether it's details in the narrative and then on the plan sheets, or calculations in the narrative and then being summarized on the NOI or some of the modules. So just make sure that when you do make changes that you go through and anywhere that those changes are necessary to be changed, that those are changed. This is just the flow chart that was part of the NOI instructions. It's sort of an easy way to see how the process is laid out. All right, so now we'll get into some of the details of the NOI. So as I mentioned earlier, the NOI is separate from the individual permit application. There is the new co-permittee form and process. So the revision date of the co-permittee form is December of 19, and it's more of just a general notification to us now that we keep on file. We don't respond with an approval letter or anything like that. It's just submitted to our office more as a notice. One thing I will mention is that on the form, there's just one line for a description of your responsibilities, and there's no sample agreement or anything like that, but I would recommend making sure that you're as specific as possible to what your permit responsibilities are. And if you need to attach a second sheet, I would recommend doing that. The permit transfer form and process is a little different as well. The form is completely different. And I think the intent of DEP here is to use the same form across multiple programs, but it is going to make it a little more lengthy to fill out, unfortunately. But if you look here, these are the 3 items on the first page. So you're going to want to put the permit number that you're transferring the permit, and it is for Chapter 102 construction stormwater. And then there are a bunch of fields to fill out on the way down through, existing permitting information, info about the site and the facility, compliance history for the existing permit and the permittee and the proposed permittee, and then some discharge information. And also keep in mind that the proof of instrument recording is required to be attached to the permit transfer document. So now we will get into some of the specifics of the NOI. All right. So this is the checklist that is part of the new NOI. It's just a good tool to use to make sure everything is included with the submission. As we go down through here, we'll sort of touch on some of the documents that have changed. We'll talk about those a little bit, but first we will get into the details of the NOI and just some of the fields that we found are maybe some of the more common mistakes that we see or just inconsistencies when the form is completed. So do keep in mind, original signatures are still required on one of the NOIs. The other one can be a copy. That one actually gets sent to DEP, a copy of this, which I'll show that later. But getting into the NOI and some of the fields, some of this is pretty similar to the past, so we're not going to highlight everything. But if here talking about site restoration, this would be across the entire site, and site restoration is described in the instructions on page 11 and page 8. So you would only check that box if your project meets these criteria or descriptions and it is across the entire site. If only a portion of your project is being restored or qualifies as site restoration, then you would not check this box, but you could provide a brief explanation as to those areas that are within your LOD that are being restored according to the site restoration criteria. And then you could pull that area out of your stormwater calculations and just have that explained somewhere so that we understand why you're doing that. Common plan of development or sale. This is dealing in the past what would have been phased projects or phased permits. There are no phased permits anymore. So if, for example, this would be a residential development and maybe had 5 sections or phases, then, and you're only looking to get approval for the first section or only half the project, then you would check this and then fill out the number of total phases and the number of phases that have been completed so far. If, for example, this was a major amendment moving into future phases. But like I said, there are no phased permits anymore. So if you are submitting an application for a residential development that does have 5 phases, but you are planning to get coverage for all 5 phases, then you would not need to check this. This is only if you're seeking approval for only part of the overall project. And this just goes into a little bit of detail in defining what I just said, and that comes from page 12 of the PAG-02 instructions. And if you are only getting coverage for the first couple phases and there's more to be done, those would be a major amendment then to this existing coverage once you want to get an authorization for the rest of those phases. Getting into the applicant information, we sometimes see some mistakes on this, but this is where you would put the organization name. So if you're an LLC or a partnership or something like that, you would put that here. And if that is the case, then you would fill out the contact information just below this area for whoever the contact would be. You would not put that down as the individual last name right below this organization name. The individual last name would only be somebody who is individually applying for their permit, maybe a single family home or something like that. Then they would be applying as an individual. And then they would put their name here and then not have to worry about filling out the contact information just below these couple fields. So here's some of the eligibility criteria that when you guys are filling out the information, you sort of have to say is true or false, and we would be looking for all of these to be true. And they do relate to some of those permit conditions where you can't use the general permit that I had highlighted earlier. One thing here with the PNDI is the PNDI receipt has to indicate either no impact or conservation measures or avoidance measures have been agreed to by the applicant. And if they haven't been agreed to, then the clearance letters from the jurisdictional agency would have to be attached or submitted prior to authorization. This is dealing with the discharges to either the MS4 or the combined sewer system. And this is that form. It is called a notification of proposed stormwater discharges to MS4s and CSSs for Chapter 102 permits. It is available on the construction stormwater website. And this is where if you were increasing or not, you would still provide this form, but it's required if you are increasing. They would have to provide that authorization to accept that increase in either rate, volume, or water quality to their system. If you are discharging to impaired waters caused by siltation, suspended solids, turbidity, etc., then you would need to use non-discharge or ABAC BMPs. And Module 3 could be used as a guide to look at all of the specific either stormwater or ENS BMPs that are non-discharge or ABAC. It's sort of a nice tool that you can use. You don't have to submit it, but it's just something that you could use to see what BMPs you could use for ABAC or non-discharge alternative. And then also discharging to an EPA approved TMDL, which could be the Bay, and in Cumberland County, that would be the entire county. Similarly, you could use Module 3 to help you determine which ABAC or non-discharge BMPs you would like to use. All right, getting into the project site information, the total project site area, so that would be the NPDES boundary. And then you would fill out the site area that's existing impervious or pre-construction impervious, and that is dealing with the total project site area. And then here would be the total impervious after construction within the total project site area. Operator information is now the fields for that. If you know who the operator is going to be at the time of application, then you could provide that here, and they would be a co-permittee, and then you would not have to worry about adding them after authorization. In the earth disturbance information, this is specifically within the LOD, so you'd put your total earth disturbance in acreage and square footage. You would also fill out the pre-construction impervious area in square footage, and then post-construction impervious area in square footage. And this number is just specific within your LOD. Down here at the Latin long, they're now asking this to be provided in decimal degrees, and the instructions ask that you provide it to 5 decimal points. Continuing on the earth disturbance information, dealing with off-site support areas. So if you would check yes here, then you would fill out the table below. If you check no, then you just move on. So when checking yes, if you are less than a quarter mile away, I should say if the support area is less than a quarter mile away, then you would fill out the top part of this table. And that earth disturbance should be included in what you just previously provided on the NOI. If the support area is greater than a quarter mile away, then that earth disturbance would not be reported on this application, and that would be its own separate potentially application or NOI if it was an acre or greater. But if it was not, then it could just be an ENS plan, but would still need to have approval for the use of that area and the earth disturbance. Getting into clean fill or fill materials. So if you're going to be importing fill material, then you would see here which was the appropriate box to check. And then there's information and DEP's management of fill policy listed there. The information in there on making sure that you are submitting or doing environmental due diligence on any material that you are bringing into the site. If at the time you are submitting your NOI, it has not been determined if the material you would be bringing in is clean fill, then you would have to go online to the certification of clean fill form, fill that out, and then keep that information and potentially submit that to DEP or the district at their request. Just a final note here that the plan drawings must include a note explaining the need for permittees and operators to conduct environmental due diligence to comply with the DEP management of fill policy. Moving on into the stormwater discharge information. So the first part of this table is to be completed for discharges during construction. If you're discharging within the Chesapeake Bay, then after you fill out your receiving water information, you would check this box, and then that's just a reminder of the need to do ABAC or non-discharge alternatives. And like I said earlier, that would be all of Cumberland County. If you are discharging to a non-surface water, you would check this box, and then just a reminder to follow the guidance on the offsite discharge analysis fact sheet or FAQ document, and that is dated 1/2/19. That will give you some guidance on what information should be provided for that offsite discharge analysis. And just a reminder here, and we deal with some issues here in Cumberland County with offsite discharges, is that this permit does not grant property rights. So even though you may get a permit to do your construction activity, that doesn't give you the legal authority for that discharge onto somebody else's property. That's something that you would have to obtain on your own if necessary. And we would just recommend that you reach out to your legal counsel for that. Then getting into stormwater discharges for after construction. It's basically the same information, but just keep in mind about discharging to the Chesapeake Bay and ABAC or non-discharge alternatives there, as well as the non-surface waters. If you'll be discharging to a storm sewer system, then you would check yes. If not, check no and move on. But if you check yes, then you would go over to this one. And if it is a MS4 CSS, you would check yes, as well as name who the storm sewer operator is. If you check no, then obviously you move on. There is the municipal notification form that I talked about earlier. So if you check yes here, that's the form number and the most recent revision date for you to look up, and that is available on the Construction Stormwater website. I had just mentioned it briefly, but if you will have a new or increased discharge to a non-surface water prior to it reaching a non-surface water prior to it reaching a surface water, then you would check yes here. And there's just a note that if yes, the applicant is expected to secure legal authority for the non-surface water discharge if the discharge will be to property not owned by the applicant, and also to provide adequate ENS controls to prevent accelerated erosion. And all that information should be provided as part of the offsite discharge analysis. Continuing on in the stormwater discharge information. So for each stormwater discharge point to an impaired water, either with or without a TMDL and including the bay, then you would complete this section for each discharge point. And this will just sort of help show and guide you through the non-discharge alternative or ABAC BMP process. And then you just put down a brief description of each of those BMPs, what they are, whether it's a compost filter sock or sediment basin with a skimmer. And as I said earlier, you can use Module 3 as a guide to help you through this and selecting the BMPs that you would like to use. And as I mentioned earlier, in Cumberland County, there are no waste load allocations in Cumberland County. Moving into the certification for the PAG02 applicants, the top section here would be for an individual person applying for the permit. And if it is just a person applying for the permit, maybe to construct a single family home, they would check the individual box there at the bottom and then just sign at the bottom of the certification section. If it is not a sole person, a single person applying, if it's a LLC or a partnership or something like that, then they would fill out this bottom section. They would put in the entity name, and then they would also check whichever appropriate box here below, whether they're a partner, the responsible corporate officer, and explain that as well. then once this bottom section is completed, then that they would also sign the certification section. All right, so that was it for going through the NOI. So now we'll get into some of the other forms and minor changes here with the PAG-02 as we go down through the rest of the checklist. So one thing I mentioned earlier briefly, but one copy of the NOI is to go to DEP, and that would go to the regional office. So you can check that if that has been done here on the checklist. The county notification form has changed, and this is just a screenshot of it. It's a one-page form, and similarly in the past, you can either submit this form to them, have them complete it and return it to us, or just provide the proof of receipt that it was sent to them and they received it. And then similarly, the municipal notification form has changed. It's almost identical to the county form, but this process is the same. You can send it to them. If they sign it, fill this out and send it back to you, you can provide that to us, or you can just provide the proof of receipt of them getting it at the municipality. And there's just a checkbox that the proof of receipts are included if that's the route that you go. There's now the ES or ENS Module 1, which Matt's going to talk about that here in a little bit. Then the PCSM Module 2, which Matt's also going to touch on that. Getting into the PCSM supporting calculations and the BMP design. You can submit worksheet 4 and 5 plus calculations from the stormwater manual if you are not using the volume part of the spreadsheet. That is still an option to not submit the volume part of the spreadsheet. And if so, then you just have to provide basically the same information through another avenue. And we've just been saying that people could use the old worksheet 4 and 5 to provide that information, and then just all your supporting calculations. PCSM supporting calcs of stormwater analysis. So when you are not using the spreadsheet, that in-depth extensive stormwater analysis is required to be submitted. And even if you do use the spreadsheet, we still sort of recommend that you do submit the extensive analysis of routing and all that, just because sometimes we take a look at that just to verify some elevations and some other cover types in that as we go through our review. As I said earlier, the volume and rate parts of the spreadsheet are optional, but if they are included, then you would check these boxes. The PCSM spreadsheet water quality worksheet is required. You don't have an option of submitting that. That is the only way that you can demonstrate water quality analysis at this point. All right. At this time, Matt is going to get into the individual permit application and start talking about that. Thanks a lot.